Hey YouTube, back with another episode of Decks on Deck, and today's episode is going to be Rainy Day Brews. Essentially, this is a deck called Stick It to the Man. The way it works is it revolves around Isochron Scepter. It's your best card, and you try to play as many things that synergize with it as possible. Now the deck runs off of 19 lands, which is kind of low, especially for a control deck, but you do find yourself drawing enough cards that you can typically justify it, not to mention the three Simian Spirit Guides that help it work out. So here's how the deck breaks down. We start off with the land base. One Shivan Reef, one Canal, one Wandering Fumarole. The Wandering Fumarole is quite useful later on because it acts as a wonderful threat once you've locked down the board state. Our basics are really simple, 2 islands and a mountain. And regarding our shocks, well, that's where things get complicated. Because it's 4 colors in very limited amount of lands, we have to make things work very efficiently. So we play 2 steam ends because the main core part of the deck is the red and blue aspects. Followed by our Hollowed Fountain, Watery Grave, and Sacred Foundry. The Hollowed Fountain isn't always fetchable because we play 4 Bloodstained Mires, but don't let that fool you. Bloodstained Mire can still hit blue, it can still hit white, it can still hit red through all these ways. So you can still get around and get any color you need. The Flooded Strand and the Arid Mesa also work wonderfully. Only downside is the Arid Mesa cannot get the Watery Grave. That being said, it's not an issue because every other fetch land can hit the Watery Grave, which is quite useful. And the black is only useful for the terminates. So here's how the deck operates. You essentially try to lock people out on turn 1 if possible. If not, you play as a wonderful control deck that has a really decent mid-range game. So the turn 1 play is you play a land, you play Simian Spirit Guide, you exile it, cast Isochron Scepter, and either play Silence or Boomerang as the imprinted spell. Now this allows you to lock your opponents out of a whole bunch of lines of play. Silence will lock out creature decks from being able to cast creatures during the main phase, from casting artifacts, sorceries. Essentially, these types of wonderful abilities will completely be limited. And this will hinder them and allow you to progress the game to your advantage and typically get a better board state. While the Boomerang is supposed to lock somebody out in a different way, in that you play it on the Isochron Scepter turn 1, then you allow your opponent to play their first land. Once the land has hit the battlefield, if it's a fetch land, you wait for them to fetch on your end step. But once you have the go-ahead, you start bouncing their land back to their hand once you play your second land on your turn, too. Once their land is in their hand, you have 2 lands, they have none, you shift the turn, they play their first land back, you untap, you play your third land, again bounce their first land back, and keep this going. So you keep them on a perpetual 1 land game, which is essentially Chalice of the Void on everything but 1. The only way around this is for them to hold up 2 fetch lands, which is quite challenging for them to do. And most times, people won't even see the line of play because they're too concerned with the Isochron Scepter and the imminent threat already established on the board. You have a variety of other spells that you can also throw underneath Isochron Scepter if the mood fits. Removal spells like Terminate, which are wonderful and allow us to access the black mana without needing to cast it. The Lightning Helix is wonderful health gain, it's just decent removal as well, along with the 4 Lightning Bolts that we have. Our counter spells work out to be 4 Remand, because Remand on Isochron Scepter is a lot of fun, because drawing 2 cards a turn is fair when they don't get to cast one of their spells. And Mana Leak. Mana Leak is fine, but it feels limited. Often you'll find your opponents, if you ever throw Mana Leak under Isochron Scepter, they'll just stall out the game and wait till they can draw the lands necessary to actually get their spells to resolve. Now it is good for stalling out a game, and if you know you can draw spells to deal with their threats once they eventually hit the board, it's a great speed bump for them to have to go over, but often you're investing a whole lot of resources in an Isochron Scepter that tends to be vulnerable against certain matchups. So I would be wary of it, and most of the time it's one of the cards that sits in your hand and just gets people. And for our card draw, we're playing the Thought Scours, not to overlook or confuse the one Dispel with the 3 Thought Scours. Thought Scour is useful as card draw because you're allowed to play it on your opponent's end step. If, let's say, they didn't cast a spell or trigger a response that would make you want to cast Isochron Scepter using your mana. you have that leftover mana, you might as well use it to draw cards. Apart from that, Lightning Bolt is wonderful. You throw it on Extra Conceptor, most times you can lock out a game pretty quickly. Now, because we're casting all these spells, along with this wonderful Dispel, which is in there to catch a whole lot of people, and 90% of the time, you pump the fist when you cast it against something like a Kolaghan's Command, targeting your Isochron Scepter. The look on their face is typically funny, and normally they have the creature already on top of their hand, ready to be flipped over into their hand. By the time they have the card down, and you just catch them, and it's a wonderful look on their face. Now, when you do have to deal with creatures when you can't lock them out with something like Silence, is your Thinking Ice. Thinking Ice is wonderful. You essentially play it, it has 4 counters. Every spell you cast takes off a counter, flips into a 7/8 that bounces all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands, which is a wonderful Wrath effect. And because we're casting so many spells, and we can recur spells every single turn with the Isochron Scepter, it allows us to get the counters off pretty darn quickly, and also allows us to choose to tap 2 mana to cast a spell to flip Thinking Ice on the stack. So it allows us the ability to go off, and allows us to be able to respond to threats by activating this ability. It's a fun little lock to get people into. Because the theme of the deck is sticking it to the man, we have Grimavomancer, which of course is a shock on a stick. It's extremely useful, and is a decent turn 1 play when you don't have the Singing Spirit Guide Isochron Scepter. Go ahead. Next is Snapcaster Mage, which is very useful when it comes to flashing back your spells, the ones that you haven't thrown on Isochron Scepter. Plus, Snapcaster Remand is a wonderful play. Snapcaster Boomerang is extremely powerful when you're trying to mess with a deck like Tron. And lastly, your best kill condition in the deck is your 2 P. Lars. You play them, you essentially get to control a board state. And if you do have something like a Boomerang and an Isochron Scepter late game, every single end step, if they don't respond to it, you get to bounce your P. back to your hand and replay it for the next turn, making more Thopters, which, when you can sink all that big mana, allows you to just ping them out at the end of the game. Extremely useful. Once again, your Wandering Fumarole is a wonderful kill con when you need it, and they've either wrapped the board or don't have any responses to an Isochron Scepter, and you haven't drawn any threats. It's a wonderful go-ahead, 4 damage for 4 mana plus itself, meaning 5 lands for a turn, is totally worth it. Now diving into the sideboard, we have a couple cards that work very well with Isochron Scepter here at the moment. Wear and Tear is still legal. It's probably not going to be in this deck anymore come rotation, because they're changing the rule again on Fuse. And how the converted mana cost works out, meaning that it's not CMC 2 or less, so it doesn't go on ice or have that dirt. But for now, it's usable. Next would be the 2 Surgical Extractions. Extremely useful, mess with graveyard decks. It's great when you can throw it on Isochron Scepter, or you can just get people. My favorite play in the deck is probably being able to Molten Rain and then Surgical Extraction in a deck like Tron. Tron has a whole lot of problems dealing with this deck in the first place. Mostly because Silence locks them out of playing their big threats and their Planeswalkers. Boomerang locks them out of essentially establishing Tron. And counterspells are really, really good when they're trying to tap out for any type of board control. Your removal necessarily isn't as good. Bolt doesn't look amazing, but you play Bolt for the other matchups, for the creature matchups, for the things that you can actually control. That's also why we play things like Anger the Gods. Anger the Gods able to deal with decks like Elves, decks like Affinity, decks like a Wide that you have a bit of trouble with, and because you have the Singing Spirit Guide, you can sometimes get them to play differently, or not even see the second red source, and play into Angered Gods. And lastly, we have the Madcap Experiment combo. Now, of course, these cards do not combo with the Isochron Scepter, excluding this does. But the Madcap Experiment Platinum Imperion combo is useful against decks like Burn. Decks when you don't want to fuss around with an Isochron Scepter, having to deal with the 2 mana and the 2 mana tapping every single turn, you board them out and board in the Isochron, you board in the Platinum Imperion combo, and with cards like Simian Spirit Guide, you get to ramp into it a whole lot earlier, and you lock out decks like Burn that are trying to only kill you with essentially life-altering effects. Rest in Peace is wonderful against decks like Dredged, and I often find myself boarding it in against decks like Grace's Control in very grindy matchups, because it allows me to completely nullify threats like Tasigur. Even if they hardcast it, we have things like Boomerang and a recurred Boomerang that really make it not a threat. And when it does hit the yard, Kalagon's command can always bring it back. So just being able to exile it and getting it out of there, and also canceling the cheap way of casting it, makes Rest in Peace extremely effective in those types of matchups, and you also board it in against, of course, decks like Dredge and things that are graveyard-based strategies. That is essentially the deck. It's called Stick It to the Man. Have a wonderful day.